I'll give my normal whinge to start with, looking at this room. It's all white men, nearly. Not quite all, but nearly. Enough that it's a problem. It's a problem because if we're creating the future, we will fix problems that we can see. And we can't experience the world in any way other than as we are. So it's not my fault that I'm a white man. It's not my fault that I think like a white man. But it's my fault that there aren't more non-white, non-men in our community to experience the joy that is software. So it's up to all of us to improve things. Pardon?
Maybe your only opinion is white men.
If I could believe that the fact that I only end up speaking to white men is due to me, that would make me so happy, because that would mean that it's only me that's got to change, and that's manageable. But seriously, we have a problem in our community. We need to do something about it, and that's up to all of us. Okay, rant over. I'm getting quite used to doing that rant everywhere I go now. I'll be ranting a bit more tonight, though, because I've had an interesting day on Stack Overflow for exactly this reason. And I thought I'll go into the slides in a bit, but before that, I'd like to sort of find out what your experiences of Stack Overflow have been like. I'm assuming that most of you have used Stack Overflow, even if it's just lurking and seen some search results. Yeah, okay. Have any of you had a bad experience on Stack Overflow? Okay, I may be preaching to the choir then. I don't know whether URC churches have choirs. We don't tend to do them in Methodism much. I was at a wonderful carol service yesterday that my kids' school was putting on. And I seem to be the only member of the congregation singing my heart out, but there we go. Entirely to a different matter. So my problem on Stack Overflow was 3 questions today. One about XML and numbers. One about someone in Java having a problem with a scanner, which is a terrible, terrible class in Java. You can tell API design and where it's gone wrong by the kind and number of questions that you get on Stack Overflow. And the third was about reading from a deflate stream. And I won't put up the questions, partly because you might have a look at the user in question in each case and things. But the first one was saying, I get a number multiplied by 10,000 when I read some data from XML. Here's my code. And there were 150 lines of code or so that I think even from the start didn't compile, because there was, right, here's a class, and here's the constructor, and here's a method. No end of the constructor, didn't have a closing brace or anything. So this clearly wasn't the whole code. And right, here's another class that uses it. And this was clearly in the middle of some ASP.NET application or similar. So there was nothing that I could start. I said, could I have a minimal, complete, verifiable example? And after about 20 minutes, he said, there you go. That's still not going to compile. It still doesn't have a main method. And there's no data. You've got a problem in your XML, and you're not showing me the XML. How can I possibly reproduce this? We went through a bit more banter and have a look now. No, I still can't copy, paste, compile, run, see the problem. Oh, try now. No, there's still no main method. What am I going to be running? Oh, deleted the question. Posted a new duplicate question about 10 minutes later. It's like, why are you doing this? I believe the problem was in one line where he was calling double.parse and passing in a string. The fact that he was writing that to a CSV file later, completely irrelevant. The fact that he was getting some XML from a web service, the web service completely irrelevant. The XML, completely irrelevant. A minimal example of that would have been using system, class test, static void main, string text equals string literal, double D equals double.parse text, and then either console.writeLine D or something like that. Like, I can say it quicker than I could have read his question before. So that's sort of what I'm talking about tonight, is how we can get to genuine, minimal, but complete verifiable examples, why they're so important, and why, if none of you have had problematic experiences where you ask a question on Stack Overflow and you get a load of people saying, you need to fix your question, if you haven't had that experience, then you're on Santa's nice list, but you need to help the rest of the community. Because there's clearly a problem. Stack Overflow has been getting a bad reputation as being a nasty place where, all these horrible moderators come and close any interesting question. Like, no, we just have quality standards. And it's not, for me, it's not really about keeping Stack Overflow's quality high. This isn't to talk about Stack Overflow, it's about developers and developer practices. Because quite often I can see a question and I know the answer, but I will force someone to go through and get a better question, because the process of doing that is more important than the answer. The answer will help them today. It's the whole teach someone to fish business. And that's where I can't possibly do that on my own. So at this point, I will actually go back to my slides. These were slides that I have presented twice from my shed both times. I work from home about 4 days a week, and I work from my shed. People keep telling me that I shouldn't call it a shed because it's a garden building. I should really have a picture of it, but basically you look down my garden and you see my office bit there, and then there is a bit that's got lawnmowers and stuff in. But my shed has an ice cream maker and some Joan Miro pictures and surround sound and things. So it's, as sheds go, it's quite nice. But I've presented this twice from my shed, once to a sort of live audience around the world and once just being recorded to then be shown. So I've never given it in front of a live audience, live and in person, so I want feedback as we go along. Well, feedback afterwards about what could be improved, but also interaction as we go along. If you're quiet the whole time, this will be a lot less interesting. I won't say it'll be deathly boring, but it'll be a lot less interesting than if you do pipe up. If you see, I've done something wrong, or, well, why didn't you do that bit first, or whatever. That'll be where actually everyone else will get a lot more out of things. Right, so where I was coming in was where you fit in with me doing this talk. I'm on a bit of a mission. So I had a mission from about 2009 or something to sort out date and time for .NET. And now I've gone about as far with that as I think I can in terms of use node at time, it will make your life better. And that's a whole other talk. And if we get through this one by the time pizzas come, I can just talk about node at time for the second half. It'll be fine. But my mission for the next however many years, via blog posts and speaking and getting other people to chip in, is to improve the world's diagnostic capabilities. And I'm not talking about anything really difficult and grand. There are cool things out there. I saw Microsoft announced recently something that Google Cloud Platform has as well in terms of diagnostic debuggers, not the kind of debugger where you step through, but where you've got a service running across hundreds of nodes and you know that sometimes something goes wrong, so you put a breakpoint, snapshot point, whatever you want to call it, on a line of code, and if that happens on any of the servers, it doesn't stop, but it captures all the information so you can get diagnostic stuff later on. So I'm not talking about that kind of stuff. That's sort of 401, or I don't know how all the American 101s and things work, but that's advanced stuff, and the world needs that, but not nearly as much as it needs good old-fashioned knowing what you're doing to start with. So I'm trying to do my best here, but I can't do it all myself. I would like you to spread the word. So that will be in your companies. Do any of you teach? No? Or go into schools and give talks occasionally? No? Okay, well, you could start doing that for one thing. And likewise, universities. I gave a talk in London Metropolitan University early this year, maybe last year. I lose track of time. about things that you don't learn in a computer science course, but that you need to be a software engineer. So I'm firmly of the opinion that there are far more people doing computer science degrees than need computer science, and there aren't nearly enough people studying software engineering seriously in order to be software engineers. So we should have more software engineering courses. But anyway, if you're going to be a computer scientist, wouldn't it be good to use source control and know about unit testing? When I talked to a room full of computer scientists, I think one person was using, there were sort of 40 or 50 people, one person using source control, about 3 people doing unit testing. What? It's just, that makes no sense to me. We need to get the word out. There are these things, they're useful. You know, Git isn't exactly friendly, but eventually you can at least learn by rote the commands that you need and then find someone who you can turn to when it all goes to pot. I was there for a while. I'm now, I use reflog effectively sometimes these days. So we need to spread the word. And I fit in by spreading the word to you, and you will go out from there. The point of this slide, if I remember my notes rightly, is that unlike some talks that I give, the idea of this certainly isn't that I come out looking smart. Okay? There are talks that I give saying, oh, look at the features of C#7. You've never seen features like this. And by demonstrating them magnificently, yes, you can learn, but I look good. And that's the main thing to come out of the talk. Okay? Not really. But that's very, very much not the point of today. The point is I will show you some code and doing really obvious stuff to code. And you will go, that was really obvious. And I'll say, yeah, it was, wasn't it? But why don't people do it? Why do people persist in saying that's a complete example when stuff won't compile? That's a minimal example. Well, you've got a load of stuff talking about a logger when that's not really, we don't need is logger enabled. If you want to write something out for the sake of the example, then console.writeLine is your friend. If you don't, fine. But there's no need to conditionalize it and try to talk to a web service and stuff. Okay, so there are 4 things to remember, techniques to remember, which are on here, and you probably guessed the rest of the talk. The main thing is divide and conquer. I talked before about this first question. I've just realized I haven't talked about the other questions at all. I'll spread them out over the course of the talk. So he was, I believe, making a web service call that returned him some XML that he was also using the old XML document API, which is just horrible. Anyone having to use that still instead of link to XML? Link to XML rocks. It's awesome. Yeah, I'm sorry. Particularly, he had to do stuff with namespaces. And that's really, really painful with XML document and really straightforward with link to XML. Yeah, so he was making a web service call, getting some XML back, parsing the XML and creating some objects, and then writing stuff to a CSV file. Okay, so that's some very distinct stages. The point of the divide and conquer technique is you've got a problem somewhere in that giant array of things, work out which, initially very coarse-grained, is the problem something to do with the web service. I can get rid of that by saying, let's imagine that my web service returns this file that I've got on the hard disk. And you can fairly easily mock that out. It kind of helps if you've got a decent architecture as well, but I can get rid of all the web service calls. Ah, look, the problem still happens. Therefore, it probably had nothing to do with the web service. Okay, well, is it to do with writing out a CSV file? If I just look at the values in the debugger, do I still see the problem? Yes. Okay, so kill the bit that's writing out the CSV. So I've got some XML that I'm parsing, and then I'm creating the objects. Well, what's the bit that's parsing the XML? Okay, I've extracted the node from the value, and when I create the object, it gets the wrong value. Okay, so throw the rest of the XML away, or 2 steps. Let's have some minimal bit of XML with just the one field or attribute, whatever you want to call it, that is parsing incorrectly instead of a huge, great document. Yep, I can still see the problem with that minimal document. What am I doing with that document? I'm extracting one string value. Okay, well, let's throw away the document, here's a string. Let's parse the string. Oh, we've got a problem. So that's the divide and conquer bit, is just working out at a course level where the issue is, and then honing down. It really is as simple as, halving the problem size each time. Picking your environment. I reckoned that this person was writing an ASP.NET application. I love web applications. I love mobile applications. I'm not an application developer. And maybe, if you are, those are the places that you're most familiar with and you can start a debugger most easily in a web application or a mobile app. I find it amazing that with Xamarin, I can have my laptop hooked up over the network to a Mac Mini that's talking to an iPad, and I can hit F5 in Visual Studio, stuff will happen magically, and I can step through in an iPad. That's really cool, but unless my problem is something to do with Xamarin and iOS, I probably don't want to be doing that. I want to be using either just a local unit test or a console application. I'm a big, big fan of console applications. So you can really easily whip up a console app. I described the sort of 9-line reproduction earlier on, and unit tests are awesome as well. When you use unit tests and when you use others, I'll talk about later on. Challenging assumptions. Basically, this is a matter of knowing that if something isn't working as you expect it to, then you don't know where the problem is. And that sounds sort of a truism, but then you find, well, I know the problem isn't here. People post this, fortunately not terribly often, saying, I'm 100% sure my code is correct, but it doesn't work. I'm pretty sure your code isn't correct. Now there are degrees of assumptions, and there are assumptions that are useful to make knowingly. Say, for the moment, I will assume that my compiler works and that the .NET base class libraries work. And if they don't, I will be able to test that later on, but I will test one thing at a time and assume that that works and that the problem is somewhere in my own code, because it usually is. And I'm not saying that in a generic way so much as the problem is usually in my code. And yes, it will be in yours, but I'm certainly not immune. I'll show some interesting assumptions later on that you might be surprised about. Keeping a log. This is relatively new to me. The idea isn't new, but I have started doing it more. Partly as a way of spreading the word is when I've started investigating something interesting, I now start writing a blog post. And I literally say, right, step 0, here's the context. Step 1, I will try to remove this part of it and showing the divide and conquer. But the great thing is, if you keep a log of what you've done and what the results were, then you won't forget it. Your memories may be a lot better than mine. My memory isn't what it used to be, as far as I can remember. But it's really easy to be utterly convinced that you tried something and it still didn't work, or that you tried something and it did work, so the problem can't be over there. Particularly if you've got that nagging, I reckon the problem is in this, and everything I've seen confirms my theory so far, so I'll just make very scant notes about what I'm testing, because I kind of know where I think I'm heading. And then later on you find, okay, it definitely isn't where I thought it was. Do you have to start again from scratch and say, everything I've recorded is now worthless? Or can you go back and say, well, there are these 2 other possibilities. Which of them is also corroborated by all the tests I've already done? Now, I mentioned console apps and unit tests. If one of your ways of diagnosing things is to use unit tests, then you can keep those along as a kind of a log of what you've done. If you want to keep them passing, or keep all but the one you're working on passing, then feel free to keep just changing what the expected value is until it matches reality, and that will at least show this is something that's true, which is probably the only time, I've only just realized it saying about it, but any of you use XUnit versus NUnit? I'm personally a big NUnit fan. We use XUnit at work, and the whole fact versus theory thing leaves me cold. But in this particular case, if you are recording facts, then that makes sense. The rest of the time, no, it's a test, for goodness sake. So keep a detailed log of what you tried and what happened. And try not to cheat. It's really, really hard not to cheat. It's very rarely a straight line when you're diagnosing things. You don't go, aha, I will learn X, I then learn Y, I then learn Z, I'm done. No, you sort of learn a few things, and then, oh, well, I thought I'd learned that, but actually it was something subtly different, and things go wrong. And if you're talking to a new programmer, because it's typically, we've learned this through 5, 10, 15, 30, whatever it is, years of programming. We've learnt the hard way, and it would be really nice if not everyone had to go through quite that much hassle. And in some ways, the struggle is part of the benefit, and that's where, you know, taking some time when writing a Stack Overflow question is really important. That struggle is how you get the answer out. But you don't need to we don't need to make it look like it's always easy and that we always get the right answer, because that just puts people off. If they see where they are and they try something and, you know, the first 3 things they try fail, if everything you've shown them always succeeds first time, then they're going to think, it must be because I'm rubbish. I will stop bothering and ask a bad question on Stack Overflow instead, or leave the industry, or whatever it is. Okay, divide and conquer. I've talked about picking your environment. I will go back to console apps versus unit tests, because I was thrilled yesterday, day before, someone tweeted saying, I followed John's advice and written a console app to try to diagnose a problem, and I got to the answer and didn't have to ask a question on Stack Overflow. It's like, yeah. And someone said, sounds like you should have written a unit test instead. Like, okay, thanks for the encouragement there. Really positive community. The unit tests are great. I certainly wouldn't talk against unit tests at all, but I personally use them for either code that I am writing at the time or have already written. You know, sometimes I will genuinely write test first code. Usually it's test alongside. You know, I write the tests before I commit. So it's, you know, same kind of time. I don't find for exploratory work, which isn't for exploring how I can use an API, that's great for TDD. If I'm exploring something is wrong in this big ball of mud, I don't always find that unit tests are as easy. Partly because I can't do it from the command line. Let me show you how I normally answer a Stack Overflow question. This probably isn't great to see at the back, but oh, here we go. So this was looking at, you might learn some C# after all tonight. Let me just put this in Notepad instead. So I don't use Notepad normally, but it's easier to get that in black on white and up the font a bit. Yeah, it's syntax highlighting is nice, but big letters good. And I can't be bothered to start Visual Studio. So normally I have Visual Studio for actual projects and throwaway stuff for little investigations. I've come up with something in between, which I'll show you in a minute. But I was trying to work out what this would do. Right, so call a member name is part of C#5. So if we say we do, let's change this to new base. Okay. Anyone now want to guess what this will print? It will print main. Those of you near the back will have to trust those of you near the front. In fact, it'll print false. Let's print the actual name as well. There we go, it prints false and then main. So call a member name as an attribute says it's only useful if you apply it to an optional parameter of type string. And if the caller doesn't provide an argument, then the compiler helpfully pops in the name of the member calling it. So that's fine here, because we're calling it from main. If we call new derived, what is calling the base class constructor? Derived, but we haven't got any members in derived. You've got a default constructor. So what do we think the output will be? It's null when using CSC. Let's see if I've got mono installed. I have. Woohoo! Right, if I now run test, it prints .ctor. Yeah, so it is the derived class constructor that is calling the base class constructor, but in fact the C#, the Microsoft C# specification actually says it won't pass in, it won't fill in the name for you. The ECMA standard that will be coming out fairly soon, I think, doesn't explicitly call out this. I hope that the C#6 specification might say that this is the right thing to do, because it feels really weird that adding public derived, that should be a no-op, right? Yeah. But it's not. If I now use rosin again, oh no, okay, that was a no-op. That feels like it should be a no-op. But it's not. Woohoo. So that was interesting C# fact that I happened to be investigating, and wasn't it easy to do? You can see all the code when I'm compiling, and this is probably why I do things from a console app rather than a unit test. I don't need to specify any other assemblies. It's just CSC test.cs. What I do these days is I have an issues directory that is now segregated into many things. And so if googlecloud.net, this is work stuff. This is all on GitHub. So these are GitHub issue numbers. So I don't, I've got Visual Studio up that's got my main solution in, and I don't want to start polluting that with unit test code, because it'll be a slight pain. I can git reset it afterwards, but it'll be slightly annoying. So what I tend to do is I would do something like dev south coast and .NET new console, and that creates a project file. And that's half the problem with starting a new application in a new project in Visual Studio, was just going through the new project wizard. Took far longer than typing .NET new. So here we are, and now I've got, I'm now in a reasonable state, and then it'll save the solution when I exit. This way of saying, well, I just want to start something where I'm exploring, and we're up, we're running, we can debug that, and it'll print hello world. That's really useful without having gone anywhere else. And I don't know why it is that when you run without debugging, you get this press any key to continue. Or I'm pretty sure it's how it starts the process. But it's kind of annoying that there's that difference between debug and not. So if you prefer to use unit tests, that's absolutely fine. But I would request that you pass on this information, unless the problem is something to do with a unit test framework, which sometimes it will be. I've got an example of that later on. If you're going to write something on Stack Overflow, this is better than an XUnit test. Why? Because not everyone's used XUnit. It's better than an NUnit test, because not everyone uses NUnit. There's one other change I would make to this, which is one of the nasty things about Stack Overflow is it's quite narrow. Namespaces are pointless in short but complete examples. That is now ready to post on Stack Overflow. You could make it shorter by putting braces on the line or whatever, but no, keep it so that it's idiomatic for someone reading the code. They're not going to care that there isn't a namespace, but they will care if you start calling things P and giving nonsensical variable names, method names, etc. So at this point, if I'm trying to investigate a problem, then it's really easy to hit the debugger and I'm away. I don't use, despite the name Diagnostic Tools, I hardly use this window at all. I just haven't been bothered to hide it. My hotspot is now up. I will just briefly, if there are any questions that happen to work with this, then let's go for it as a live demo. Malformed data. Nothing is screaming, this is going to be a really good thing to demo. What I might do is have another look. See that? That's probably not a good diagnostic one. There could be interesting stuff, but it's not a diagnostic one. What I will do during the break is see if I can find one. It's just, protobuf.net is not my protobuf compiler, but look, oh, I like this question already. It's got a fairly complete missing using directives, but that's not too bad. And it's got some useful detail. Yeah, I will probably upvote that later on. So it won't be a good example of what extra diagnostics to give, because it's already kind of in a shape where I feel that I would be able to look at that. Even though I haven't used protobuf.net for a long time at least, I would be happy to look at that because the questioner has given me enough information that I can probably reproduce the problem without any extra knowledge. That's a really good thing, not just for getting an answer, but for anyone who later comes along and thinks, well, I may have the same problem or not. And if you've got something that lays out the problem really clearly, then you can tell. Right. That was pick your environment and various other things. Challenging assumptions. I mentioned earlier on some assumptions that you might have. So as before, assume that your code is the one that is the code that's broken. Next, if you can't find anything wrong in your code, it may well be something in that third-party library that someone emailed you, the DLL. That feels more likely than that you found a bug in JSON.NET, which in turn feels more likely than you found a bug in ASP.NET Core. Or maybe it doesn't, I don't know on those. Those both feel more likely than you found a bug in string, which people will say, you know, string.indexOf is clearly broken because this bad code. No. And the compiler. Now, I love finding bugs in the compiler. Very few things make me happy. That sounds really, really sad. There are many things that make me happier than finding bugs in the compiler, but it does make me kind of happy. Almost as happy as finding a bug in the spec, which happens as well. So bugs in the compiler do happen, but they're pretty rare. But it's not just in terms of your code that you, or the code that's running, that you should be thinking of things to be skeptical of. I don't know how much of your time you folks spend in the debugger. I try not to spend very much time at all, partly because the debugger lies to you. It lies in really obvious ways. Have I still got this? Yes. Okay, let's give a simple example. I could find 100 questions on Stack Overflow that look like this. Okay. And I'm going to say, I don't want double backslashes in my text. So I'm going to do text as text.replace. And if you're really lucky, someone will post this much code and only this much code. And look, we've just replaced all the double backslashes. But if you can see, nearer the back, trust those near at the front, it's saying text is C:\, double backslash users, double backslash John. Well, we only started with one, and just in case there were two, we've replaced 2 with 1. What can possibly be going wrong? It's like, the debugger is lying to you. The debugger helpfully escapes things for you, and I can see how that could be useful. If you've got a tab in there, it's kind of nice to know that's a tab. Backslashes, this is evil. I keep meaning to have a word with Dustin Campbell and the like and say, can we please do something about this? Every time there's a Stack Overflow question that is someone not understanding that the debugger does something, there should be a little counter going off in Microsoft for, you know, a little bit like the build is broken. This has been a problem for years and years and years. And these days, enough people do know about it that when a question is asked like this, I am often not the first person to say, I bet you're looking at this in the debugger, aren't you? Because they won't see, if they actually got as far as console.writeLine text, if they were writing a console application, then they could see the output of thing with single backslashes. But they're not. They're saying the value of text is, but not saying how they're seeing it. So they don't know yet that the debugger is lying to them. The other thing that the debugger has is the immediate window. Now, when I do use the debugger, I basically use breakpoints, the call stack, and the local and watch windows, and that's all. I never use the immediate window, but I gather there are people who find it really useful. And that's fine, so long as you realize it lies to you. Or it sometimes executes code in subtly different ways, and the ways in which it's subtly different to code that you write in your main program, they've changed over time subtly as well. I think with Roslyn, it's actually closer now than it was because it's, I think, using the scripting engine. So things like overload resolution should really be pretty close, but I have seen it do very odd things with conversions and things like that. So it's not a case of don't use the immediate window. It's be aware that if you start seeing something funny, it may not be that the actual value is funny, but that the problem is in the immediate window. So at that point, put that code into your program and make sure you log it somewhere that you know what's going to happen. Strings are funny things as well. I've mentioned the string that you see in the debugger. What I should really do, will Notepad handle this? Demo code, be using C#. Odds and ends. Yes. Right. So let's pop this little beastie into Visual Studio. So we're convinced we're not going to look in the debugger anymore. We're just going to print out the value. And this will be fine. So, oh, we've got a question mark. Well, that's interesting because there didn't seem to be a question mark in our original source code. But at least it's one question mark. If I'd done something else, we might see nothing and get 2 question marks, or maybe see 1 character and get 2 question marks out. And if we print the length of text, this is going to print that it's got a length of 8, whereas we can see 7 things. So one of the nice things about the Windows console is that it's fairly rubbish at doing anything non-ASCII. Nice in some cases. What's less than 9 and infinite? Infinity. Positive infinity. What's this going to print to the console? 8. There we go, look, 8. It hasn't got an infinity sign, so, oh, we'll just turn it on its side. No one will know the difference. I point this out not to, just because if you're trying to debug something and you're getting an error that something's much too big. Okay, I'll print out the actual value, 8. What the hell do I do now? In fact, I think if you options, oh, you can't change the code page there. Let's run this code from here. This will print 8 again, eventually. If I do chcp 65001, whoa, infinity sign. Very small, but it is there, I promise. That 65001, that's the Windows code page for UTF-8. Worth remembering. So if you're seeing weird stuff in a console, then get to a stage where you can do chcp 65001, and you'll be away. But I want to give you a better tool for this. So this is something to actually remember that I don't think I've put in the slides, but it's easy to remember. If you go to tinyurl.com/unicode-explorer, you come to the only bit of JavaScript that's on the web that I have written. I'm not good at JavaScript. I'm not proud, but this, it's at the end of a page that's all about Unicode and C# and stuff. But actually, this is the most useful bit of the page. If you paste some text in there, it shows you every character and the Unicode value of it, and its UTF-16 representation and its UTF-8 representation. These two will differ for things that aren't in the basic multilingual plane. So someone shout out an emoji. I was having a little bet with myself. Unicode pile of poo. It had to be. So if you already know what the character is, then fileformat.info is great. But if has it got something that I can copy? Can I copy that? Yes, hopefully. So if I copy the Unicode pile of poo, there we go. So it's saying that the Unicode value is 1F4A9, and the fact that it's got 5 characters here means that it's not in the basic multilingual plane. That's represented as a surrogate pair, low surrogate followed by high surrogate, and in UTF-8 it's those 4 bytes. The number of times I have found this page useful when I hadn't expected it to, this was mostly for my own benefit, but I've seen Stack Overflow posts where someone said, this code doesn't compile, it's saying there's an error in the middle of that method call, that method name, and you put it in, you copy it, put it in here, and it turns out there's some non-breaking, zero-width non-breaking space or something that's particularly evil. I will show you what the character is that's in here, just to give a bit of trivia. It's really nice having more time. So when I've previously presented these slides, it's been a 1-hour slot, and I haven't been able to go over. So having sort of an hour and a half-ish is great. So this character here, Unicode 180E, every so often the Unicode consortium runs an Adopt a Character funding campaign. I have tried several times to adopt the Mongolian vowel separator and failed. It's my favorite character because of it's sort of done the hokey-cokey in Unicode categories. So in C#, there's identifier sort of normalization. So there is a Unicode category called formatting characters, where you can have as many formatting characters within an identifier as you like, and then it will still be the same identifier as one that doesn't have those formatting characters. All good so far. So I will tell you that at the moment, the Mongolian vowel separator is a formatting character. So this identifier and this identifier are the same. In an earlier version of Unicode, it was a white space character, at which point it would be string x, and it would be introducing a new variable called x and not changing the value of the field at all. In an earlier still version of Unicode, it was a formatting character. It's done the hokey-cokey of Unicode categories. Now, not only that, that's sort of bad enough to start with, but what version of Unicode does C# use? Anyone happen to know? So the Microsoft specification says it uses Unicode 2. And that's the version that used to ship with the old native CSC compiler. Let me just check. Oh no, sorry, 3, not 2, 3. So it was there as a formatting character. The ECMA standard said, no, it's 4. So you could have this, this program is valid C# under both the Microsoft specification and the old ECMA standard, and it would mean different things. In the new ECMA standard that I've been helping to standardize, and what Roslyn does, it's some version. We'll just kind of head off now, because the reality is that Roslyn uses whatever .NET provides it with. You know, Roslyn is running on .NET, which has a version of Unicode, so it will call char.get Unicode category or whatever it is. So it's whatever, and we've made sure that the standard says it will be some version of Unicode. But it's just so joyous that it changes and the specification and standard don't match up, so you get this weird effect. Okay, enough of that silliness. Let's get to some more silliness. But I must remember to do that Unicode, fix that file. I didn't have a chance to look over Stack Overflow over the break, so we won't be trying to find something else to do. Another question to answer. However, where were we? Strings floating point. So I've shown how strings can be wrong. It should be of no surprise to anyone that floating point is a bit more complex than you might expect. I blame the C# language for defaulting to double. I reckon if when I typed 0.1 that was decimal, people would use decimal a lot more than they use double, and they would be confused a lot less of the time, because double is almost never the right thing to use, in business applications at least. But the console output shows you a value. I can't even remember. In Java, it's really precisely said that double dot to string shows you the shortest representation that is unique. So if you've got 14.1, it can show you 14.1 because there is no double value that is, no two double values that are distinct will both show 14.1, so it must be the closest one to exactly 14.1. I have another bit of code that is on the same C# in-depth website that you may find useful. I generally keep a copy of it lying around in my test directory, called Double Converter, which I should really make slightly easy to use at some point. But it's a bit of code I wrote many years ago that the only interesting bit is that it has two exact string that takes a double. And if we write some code that's going to use it, I'll put this in Notepad in a minute. Double D equals, should we go with 0.1? Should we see what 0.1 actually is? Double converter dot to exact string. See, this is where I should make it an extension method or something like that. Right, so if we bring that up in a more readable font, that's not too bad. And then we do need to include it when we're building. There we go. Right, and so that will show you the exact value. And it's worth being aware of, and this is sort of just general floating point knowledge, that not every decimal value has an exact representation in binary floating point. But every binary floating point value, leaving aside nans and infinities, I'll tell you another bug in .NET soon, every normal and denormal floating point number has a precise decimal representation. So this double converter, so long as you give it something that isn't nan or positive or negative infinity, will always spit out a sequence of digits and a dot that is the precise value of that double. There's no approximation. So a double is not, I get frustrated where people say, oh, double's an approximate type. No, it's not. Every double value is an exact number. It's just that when you write double x equals 0.1, that conversion from the source code of 0.1 to that's an approximation. And when you do addition or something like that, that will probably have to do some rounding. But it's all well specified. It's not kind of, the idea of, oh, they're approximate types makes it sound like they could be just anything, really. No, they're exact values that when operations are performed, you might lose some information. Just like, no one would say integers are approximate types. But if I divide 7 by 3, then I don't get the exact value. You know, we expect that there will be rounding going on. And no one says that either 7, 3, or 2 are just approximate values. They're approximations to the actual value of 2 1/3, but it's still, the value 2 is a precise value. Do you want to see how double is broken? Just actually broken. I only found this out quite recently, doing some protobuf stuff. Okay. Let's hope that this works. Double to int 64 bits. Oops. D1. Bit converter dot int 64 bits to double D2. Sorry, temp +1. Okay, and hopefully these will both be nans. I keep talking about nans, kind of assuming that you all know something about them. Is anyone going, I have no idea, I might as well be reading Twitter at the moment? So nan is not a number. So things like, what's the square root of -1? Well, it's not a number, because we don't have complex numbers. Let's just check that we're good so far. Yes, they're both nans. So what's going to happen if I write D1, is D1 equal to D2? So we reckon there's the single person who's happy to do that said false. What about that one? False. Okay. How about that one? False. How about this one? True. Okay. And how about, I'm not expecting exact values here. I'll be quite dumbfounded if you can predict the exact value. And if it happens again, I'll know there was a plant from this time. So, okay, let's see what happens. Let's bump as the actual results are. Oh, this mouse is not obeying me properly. Right. Okay. As that's bigger, is that still readable even though it's white on black at the back? Yeah. Okay. So we've got that they're nans. False and false. Yes, the equality operator on nan. It's a bit like null in SQL. It isn't even equal to itself. However, when you do equals, well, we said false and then true. No, one nan is equal to another. So in IEEE 754, the floating point standard, there's just one positive infinity and one negative infinity, one positive 0 and one negative 0. But there are lots and lots of nans. There are what are called signaling nans and quiet nans. The idea being that in certain circumstances, a signaling nan might effectively throw an exception, whereas a quiet nan wouldn't. But there are many, many bit patterns that throw it. And I was fortunate that this is just a way of saying, well, I'll take two bitwise representations that are only 1 bit apart. If this hadn't worked, I'd change that to a -1, and then I suspect it would have done, because it's something in the top set of bits that counts. So they are equal to each other, but look at this. They've got different hash codes. That's not allowed. Oh no, it's too much hassle to put this into .NET Core. I think this was fixed in some version of the .NET Core CLR, I think. But yeah, bit of a pain. I won't show you the other weird thing that I found, although it's a great example of diagnostics. Yeah, sorry, I'll find it. Just the blog post. So I've said I've been blogging about diagnostics, and I think the most recent one that I did was very, very odd and a JIT compiler bug. So, I did say, assume that the compiler works and the runtime works and the base class library. Well, just sometimes, no, it really doesn't. And this was a weird situation. So, I didn't actually introduce myself, by the way. I'm John. But I work for Google, and my job at the moment, I used to have to come and say, I'm not representing Google. At Google, I do Java, whereas I'm doing C# now. I now work in C# all the time. It's great, making Google Cloud Platform rock for C# developers. So that's the sales pitch, and I work particularly on the libraries. So if you're trying to talk to any of our amazing services, vision and speech recognition and video intelligence and all kinds of things, then come use my libraries. It will give you a lovely experience, which previously our API experience has been sometimes adequate, but certainly not delightful. I aim to make it delightful. So I've been working on Cloud Firestore, and I had some unit tests that were only failing on Linux. And these were really quite noddy looking unit tests where I would create, we've got a struct that's geopoint, which is just a latitude and longitude. And I was having a unit test saying, well, I expect that when I parse this from a protocol buffer or whatever, that it will be equal to this. And it's simple code. It really should work. It works on Windows. .NET Portable, it's all fine. It failed on Linux. Sorry, it also failed on, it worked on my local machine, including did it work on one of my Linux boxes? I think. But it was failing on Travis. And these days, now, one of the things that was pointed out to me, and this is where I appreciate this kind of thing. So I have a separate Linux box. I have two little Intel NUCs called Bagpuss and Gabriel. For those of you who enjoyed Bagpuss back in the day, the idea was that Bagpuss would be running, I can't even remember which CI system it was, and all the others would be agents, and when Bagpuss would go to sleep, all his friends would go to sleep. But it was just a nice naming convention. They run my Node-time benchmarks because I don't trust cloud machines to always be of exactly the same. If you're running micro benchmarks, you really want to make sure you've got the exact same environment, ideally the same chip. Well, when I've got two of these that have the same, at least the same model, and I can make sure that nothing else is running on them at 2 in the morning and 3 in the morning, I'm as close to being ideal circumstances for a benchmark as I can get. So that's why I've got them, but it's also handy during the day to be able to occasionally run bits of code. Someone else said, but hang on, you've got a Linux box already. Is that one? That's my Windows box. Yeah, but you can run Linux on it. Not dual booting or anything, the Linux subsystem for Windows managed to reproduce this. And I wish I'd found that out. Wish I'd thought to try it before I'd started it all, because it's the Linux JIT compiler for .NET. So when I'm running Bash on here, it really is running the .NET Core build for Linux with the Linux JIT, and so it shows the problem. So yeah, that would have made things much, much simpler. So I first kept Firestore, but made it into a console app. So I kept this was my production code, but let's get rid of XUnit because I know that XUnit is going to be doing interesting things. So I will introduce my own assert here, which doesn't have very much. Yeah, doesn't fail or anything. This is the noddiest unit test framework that you've ever seen, but that's all it needs to be. So I'm creating two geopoints that are the same, 1.25 and 2.5 as the latitude and longitude. And then what I'm checking is that when I call the equality operators via reflection, that they should give the right results. And I get, no, it's not. So we're already in a situation of, I'd gone from a solution with many thousands of lines to 33 lines of code. I'd gone from including references to, I suppose at this point I've still got references to gRPC and all kinds of services. I'm not calling any of them, but for my peace of mind, the fact that I'm working in a smaller code base is useful. So that's where I have a bias against unit tests for this exploratory work, just because if I've got 20 different files that are tabs in Visual Studio, and I know I'm working in thousands of lines of code, even if I know that half of them aren't being used, it makes me nervous. Whereas by the time I'm in a console application where either I've started off by copying a load of code and then deleting half of it, or I prefer to build up from scratch, then I can take more notice of, I know exactly what's running. And if I've written main, then I know there isn't any weird stuff going on behind the scenes with XUnit having to cope with asynchronous tests and maybe having some extra tasks in the background and it going via a Visual Studio plugin and then maybe back out again, and all kinds of things that unit test frameworks do to be really helpful most of the time. So having reproduced that, I then wanted to remove Firestore entirely. And this is where I made a mistake. And this is where I want to log that I'm making mistakes. So I did too much. What I should have done is copy geopoint, which was a really simple struct. It hardly did anything. I could have copied that straight into my test project and then removed the dependency and reproduced it. That was the right thing to do one thing at a time and log it. But no, I'm too clever for that. I will come up with a new struct of my own that has a single double value. So 1.5 here, and it doesn't do much else. This code is really just comparing the values. All of the test code is what it was before. But no, this doesn't reproduce it. Silly John. So it prints true 3 times. It's actually testing equality 3 different ways. So once testing it not with reflection, once testing it by invoking the method directly with reflection via method info, and the third time, sorry, that's the third time. The second time, it's having, what am I doing? Oh yeah, both times it's invoking the method, but once via a delegate. So I clearly at some point had the thought that this was something to do with delegates. Okay, so no luck there. Let's go back to 2 doubles, and this now reproduces it. So this is really similar code to the previous one. It's just we've got 2 doubles here instead of 1. So at this point, I'm on very much scratching head grounds. I'm thinking this is going to make a great bug report at some point. And I'm pretty sure at this point that it's really, really not my Firestore code that's wrong. Having assumed that it was my code to start with, I've now proved pretty concisely, if pretty firmly, that it's not. if this doesn't work, but the same thing with only a single double does work, there's something very weird going on. I tried it in a few different frameworks and environments, and it was fixed in, right, so true means it's working, true, false, false means it's failing. So this was showing that it was failing for Netcore app 1.0 in both debug and release, and working for Netcore app 1.1 in both debug and release. And that's just a little bit of the exact details of what I got installed, because by this point I've realized I really need to be logging everything in quite a lot of detail. So I then start putting in some extra logging. This is quite dangerous. I'm relieved that this did show the problem, but there are times where it might not have done, because by using console.writeLine, I could have blown up any chance of inlining. I could have fixed things. There are times where the JIT compiler can use larger 80-bit representations of floating point numbers, so long as you don't need the 64-bit representation for something like a field. So there can be times where you can have the exact same code, but sometimes it's using a field and sometimes it's using a local variable, and they will give different results because the field really, really is only 64 bits wide, whereas the local variable, that's probably in a register somewhere. That can be the extended representation of 80 bits. That's fine, and it gives you different results when you do something that would otherwise have to round. So I was really relieved to see that this gave completely bizarre results. So when we call the comparison directly, we see that the left and right-hand side are both 1.5, 2.5. When we call it with reflection, we get 1.5 and bleh, some random crap. A very, very small number. So it's 1 with 316 zeros in front of it, or at a point. Seeing that I'm only halfway through the blog post, I will let you go and find that. This is on codeblog.johnskeet.uk. Let me just check. I think if you just do codeblog John Skeet, yes, okay, you'll find it. It's the second or third post that's up. The point is, this took me 2 or 3 hours investigating this. Many people would have asked a question on Stack Overflow without trying any of that. And I was chatting to someone over the break about what the purpose of Stack Overflow is. And I'd like to make sure that you all know what the purpose is, so that if you talk to someone, I was really glad that no one had had bad experiences. But if you talk to someone who's saying, oh, Stack Overflow is horrible, it's run by control freaks who don't want to help anyone. No. It's just that we understand the design of the site is around the purpose, which is not to help you, not to help the person that's got a problem. It's to build a repository of high quality questions and answers. So if you ask a question really badly that I happen to know the answer to, and I give you the answer, you go away happy and you leave a stain on the site. Okay? That does not help the site's goal. And that's why, it's certainly why I can end up looking very passive-aggressive and control-y when I say, please improve your question. I'm thinking, I know what's wrong. I know what's wrong. Please improve your question. And there are 2 benefits from this. One is, hopefully, it helps them do work that next time they will do before getting to the site at all. They will become better developers by doing it. And the other is, by the time you've got a good question, then, okay, you may have found the answer, but it's much more helpful to someone else. And that's why it's so important, and it's not that we're all control freaks. And that's a message that's quite hard to get over to people, partly because there are some people who just get off on saying nasty things. Stack Overflow is on the internet, and strangely enough, there are trolls on the internet. Who'd have thought? So some people have had bad experiences that aren't their fault. A lot of the time, it's because they don't understand the site. They've ticked through. So when you first go to ask a question, you have to go through a page that says, this is what the site's for. Here's how you ask a question. Look, there are links on the right to how to ask a good question, which I'll give you another link, another tiny URL link. Stack-hints goes to another blog post of mine from 2010, long time ago. But this is all still basically right, or right in my mind, about how to ask a good question. And a lot of it goes into the kind of thing that we've been talking about. So that's linked from Stack Overflow. And you've got to tick a box saying, hey, I've read all of this before I can ask a question. And of course, a lot of people do scroll down, tick, right, here's random crap. My program doesn't work. I think the words doesn't work should be banned. Not quite, but if you say my code doesn't work without giving any more detail, that's like saying to the doctor, I'm ill, what's wrong with me? Like, I need a bit more information, I'm afraid. Doesn't work, doesn't cut it. Is it an exception? Does the code not compile? Does it compile and run without an exception but give you the wrong result? What is the wrong result? What is the right result? Why do you think that is the right result? All of these things are reasonable things to expect. I will go back to my slides to get some sense of structure back very briefly. We haven't had time to go into a single one of the other demos. I've got a whole solution of demos for this talk, none of which we'll get to because I've been busy doing other demos instead. This is an important point, though. I've said about how some people get bad experiences on Stack Overflow that are their fault. Even if they're their fault, because they didn't read the site, those people are still people and deserve to be treated with respect. Those people should be treating everyone else with respect as well. And I get very cross when someone writes a rant on Stack Overflow saying how horrible everyone is to them, and you look at their comments and they haven't treated anyone with respect. This goes way beyond Stack Overflow, though. So the techniques in terms of diagnostics and breaking problems down, etc., I use all the time for bug reports. So a good question on Stack Overflow and a good bug report look very, very similar. You might include a little bit more environmental information on a bug report, but basically I treat them as the same. So if I'm filing a bug report, typically with Microsoft for something like that double.nan, I make sure I've got a short but complete example, if at all possible. These days, if it's a .NET Core project, I include the project file as well. So even if you don't want to copy and paste just the C#, you could copy and paste C# and the project file, .NET run, and you're away. Woohoo! It will bring in all the dependencies. You don't need to do anything else. It's great. Wouldn't have been feasible back in the old CS proj bleh. But with the new .NET Core SDK, it's great. But how many of you have filed a bug with an open source project? Gosh, do you just not use open source? Or you happen to use open source that doesn't have any bugs? Or you're too nervous to... Nice. You must let me know what that open source is. I filed bugs, and people file bugs on Notepad. And it's great. Open source maintainers love getting bug reports from people who are respectful of the fact that they've done, put their code up there to start with and their time in investigating things. So when someone files a bug, it's great if it comes like a Stack Overflow question and with some collaborative aspect. Say, if they say, I'd really like to help fix this if I can, fantastic. If they say, I need this done by Tuesday because my client is getting cross, well, sorry, that's not my fault. We have a very bizarre situation with someone who didn't say that. They did say, we have clients who are running into this, but they're using serialization on things that aren't marked as serializable by calling stuff by reflection and things. It's like, that's never going to work. Just don't do that, please. But yeah, I do think that the software world would be a much, much better place if we could remember that every time we wrote an email or filed a bug report or responded to a bug report, this is an actual person who's going to feel bad or feel good depending on what we write. Have some demos. If you're still stuck, do ask on Stack Overflow. So I have mentioned that you'll often find the answer by doing all of this stuff. If you do, you may be able to think of a good Stack Overflow question from that. If you had to do something non-obvious, that makes a really good Stack Overflow question because someone else is going to be in the same position. And by the time you've come up with the short but complete example, that's 3/4 of the time that you should be spending on a Stack Overflow question is doing all that diagnostic work. Translating that into a good question should be reasonably cheap. And assuming it's not a duplicate, it's likely to get upvoted. And I think it's a shame that question upvotes are only worth 5 when good questions are much rarer than good answers. I'm seeing the Stack Overflow folks in February. I think I'll have a chat with them about that. Maybe say it on the podcast if I can. And this is the stuff to take away because I'm running out of time. Mostly spread the word because none of this was particularly difficult. I didn't demonstrate the divide and conquer in code as I would have done, partly because it sounds like you're all very intelligent folks who kind of know the procedure of sometimes you just start deleting code, sometimes you start from scratch. But show the people that you work with, particularly if you are mentoring junior developers. It's really valuable when you get stuck on something or when you start getting stuck. You know, when you get that feeling that this is going to be an interesting bug, you know that feeling, yeah? And you know it might take half an hour. It will be the most valuable half an hour of a really junior developer's day if you say, come and help me, let's look at this together and pair program on it, because that's a great way of seeing, oh, hang on, you've assumed that. It's like, yeah, your eyes have just skimmed over it completely. So they may well be able to actually help you, but you will be able to help them by giving them this experience of diagnostic work. The URL's there, but don't bother remembering it because we'll make sure that you can get copies of the PowerPoint. I would give you a link to the PowerPoint, but that's kind of self-referential. Thank you very much. Have swag. Do we have time for any questions if people have questions? It was a very rambly talk, which I kind of apologize for, but it's really nearly Christmas. Oh, yeah. So someone used to, lots of people said, how much time do you spend on Stack Overflow? And my normal, not entirely glib answer is, how much time do you spend breathing? It's just a background activity. It's something I go, you know, open Stack Overflow, open CNN, open 538, open BBC News. That's kind of the tabs that I have always open and just keep checking every so often.
So I'm investigating a bug. I can write my blog article about it. And my blog article will influence nobody.
Right.
Your blog article will influence people.
Right. So yeah, these are all just different ways of logging. So for one thing, if any of you blog a diagnostic process, tweet it at me and I will immediately retweet and link to it from my blog and whatever. So that can have effect. But otherwise, it's just what gets you there. So I make the point in my notes that I wasn't reading from that, you know, start a Word doc or a Google doc or whatever and write down whatever's going to be useful to you. It doesn't need to be pretty. One of the bad sides of writing a blog post is you're constantly trying to frame it thinking, oh, well, I've got people who don't have any of the context, so I've got to write a paragraph here and I sort of get slightly out of the zone. Don't care about that. Write just a doc that captures it. Reality is normally I write it on paper, which won't be readable by me the next day probably, let alone anything else. But that's where I start. If I'm doing benchmarking, I will write down the results as numbers just there. But yeah, unit tests are a great way of capturing that, and version control commits. create a branch, create as many branches as you need, and put copious notes in the commits and know that you can just delete stuff later on. It's great. Anyone not using version control and trying to do diagnostic work is really trying to do it with one arm tied behind their back and hopping. Yeah, version control is great.
So I was going to ask a question about diversity and how can we help to change it?
How can we help to change it? Right, so I'm seeing Hamilton on Tuesday, but I've got until then. So hiring. There are many hiring practices that I'll take a step back. I genuinely, both of those, don't think that most people believe themselves or try to be discriminatory. So I will say I'm racist because I probably am, but I'm trying not to be. It's understanding unconscious bias. And women can be as sexist as men against women, and it happens. Unconscious bias really sucks. And I know that there were some tests for it that have been discredited, somewhat discredited, but I think there's also sufficient evidence that the unconscious bias does still come on. So look at your company's hiring practices and see where you can tweak that for best practices. I can tell you a little bit about Google's hiring practices, which is that there's no such thing as a diversity hire in Google, but there is such a thing as, I don't think we say diversity candidate now, but candidate from an historically underrepresented category. And I know pigeonholing people is also horrible, but the idea is if you're trying to get, everyone has to meet the bar because no one wants to hire bad people. That's bad for everyone involved. The person hiring, the team that they end up with, the person being hired, etc. But if there are people who you're not sure about, if you've got a line out the door of similar people, then it's probably not worth putting in several hours to find out whether actually they are over the bar. If there's a couple of areas that you're not sure about, if you've got a queue of, there's someone over there, if I really reach out to them, then it's worth putting in a bit more time to see whether actually they're good enough and we hadn't properly tested that aspect. So making sure that your hiring practices reflect that and that everyone knows that. Because even if, I think it probably still happens in Google sometimes, that we can say, this is what our hiring practices are, but can you imagine going into a team and saying, oh, you're the token girl we've hired? Oh, makes me so mad. So everyone needs to be aware of why and what the practices are. That's a little bit about hiring. For community events, code of conduct, making sure that you good folks talk to other people in your community and encourage people and say, right, you may have heard bad things about user groups in general, but DevCo Southeast is really good, etc. DevCo South, rather, sorry. All right, yeah. I don't know, South Coast. Some combination of Dev, South, and Coast. I don't know where the East came from at all. But yeah, I was reading a blog post today by someone saying how they've been sexually harassed at various conferences. It's just got to stop. It really has. There has to be absolutely zero tolerance. And you can tell that there still is tolerance. This woman's writing saying, here is a well-respected academic who is also well known to have harassed people. They shouldn't be well respected anymore. That behaviour does not deserve any respect. I'm sort of losing the plot a bit, partly. After a couple of hours of speaking, I tend to go a bit. But yeah, it's got to be a cultural thing that we've got to all accept that it is important to get diversity, that we will end up in a better working environment, have more fun, get better products. You know, I use far more technical products than I build, so why would I not want the best people building technical products? And if you immediately discount half the world's workforce, you won't get as good products. It's kind of self-explanatory. So we've got to all take that on and make sure that everyone is supportive of that as a goal. Yeah, I wish I had better